As we study planets, one of the keys is understanding what is and is not a planet. And so what we're going to look at today is what makes something a planet. Here are a number of photographs of different objects in our solar system. Some of them are planets. You should recognize this. We have Jupiter, but some of them are not planets. Why are some of these things that are in our solar system considered planets while others are not? I just want you to start thinking about that. What makes some things a planet, other things not a planet? What do you think the criteria should be? I'm going to pause and I want you to write down your definition of what a planet is. Now there's different criteria that we could possibly look at. Is it the size? Is it the shape? Is it the color? What it's made of? How far away is it from other things? How far is it from the sun or from Earth or from other objects? Does it have moons? Does it have an atmosphere? What's the temperature? There's a lot of things that we could look at, a lot of different criteria that we could use to figure out if something is a planet or not. So what makes some things a planet and others not? Which criteria are important? Well, is it the size? Here we have the Earth, we have Mercury, and we have our moon. And if you take a look at our moon, it's almost the same size as Mercury. Mercury is a planet, the moon is not. What makes Mercury a planet and not the moon? Here's everything that's in our solar system that is 400 kilometers or bigger. And at 400 kilometers, you have enough gravity in order to make yourself roughly round, spherical in shape. At 400 kilometers in diameter, that's roughly the size that you need to be spherical in shape. That's where your gravity is then stronger than the electromagnetic forces in between the atoms of whatever object you're talking about, and you turn into a sphere. If we only use size as our criteria for if something is a planet or not, well, we're going to have maybe 100 or so objects. The moon would be a planet. Many of the moons of Jupiter and Saturn would be planets. So why are some things that are big enough to be round considered a planet and others not? Is it their shape? Do you have to be round? Well, the sun is round. The moon is round. Saturn's rings are round. The Oort cloud is round. Many other moons are round. Asteroids can be round. Comets can be round. Is it just the shape? Is planethood only based on whether or not something is round? Is it the distance from the sun? Well, if it's the distance from the sun, why would asteroids not be considered a planet, but Jupiter and Saturn are? Where would we stop? Some things are relatively close to the sun. Some things, like long period comets, are really, really, really far away. So if it is distance, where's the imaginary line where something is a planet versus not a planet? Do you have to have an atmosphere? Well, some planets do have an atmosphere, others don't. Earth has an atmosphere, Mars has an atmosphere, Jupiter and Saturn have an atmosphere. Mercury does not have an atmosphere, but it's still a planet. So you don't necessarily have to have an atmosphere because Mercury doesn't. If it's an atmosphere, why did Pluto get kicked out? Because Pluto has an atmosphere, but Mercury doesn't. Mercury is a planet and Pluto's not. Turns out Pluto's atmosphere is actually bigger than planet Earth's. It doesn't seem like it's having an atmosphere that makes something a planet. What about what it's made out of? Well, what should a planet be made out of? Is it rock? Is it metal? Is it mostly gas? What should a planet be made out of? What about its orbit? Does its orbit have to look a certain way in order to be a planet? What should that orbit look like? There's a number of things in our solar system that are orbiting different shapes, different angles, different distances. What about an orbit makes something a planet? Maybe it's what the object orbits. Maybe it has to orbit a specific thing to be considered a planet. As of now, we've got 8 planets in our solar system: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. Although Pluto is here on my screen, being bigger than Jupiter, Pluto is not considered a planet. So we've got 8 planets. 1, 2, 3, 4 inner rocky planets, 5, 6, 7, 8, 4 outer gas giant planets. However, if you were to go back in time, let's pretend that we are going in a magic school bus back through history to the year 1850. How many planets would we be talking about? Let's go even farther back than 1850. All right, let's go back to 1543, and we have 7 planets. Let's see if you guys can name them. The 7 planets from 1543. Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the Sun, and the Moon. 7. And then in 1543, something happened. Nicholas Copernicus published a book that put the Sun at the center of our solar system, not the Earth. And all of a sudden, people realized that the Sun is not a planet. The Moon is not a planet. So how did we lose one planet? Well, now we had Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Six planets. And those are the 6 planets that you can see with your naked eye. A little bit of time goes on, and 1781, 7 planets. We found another one. We've got telescopes by this time, and Uranus was discovered. So Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, 7 planets. All right, between 1781 and 1851, we have 23 planets. Can you guys name them? Well, as the telescopes got bigger and better, and we had found Uranus, we also kept finding planets in between Mars and Jupiter. And they were named. They were added to the list of planets, and students who were in astronomy classes had to memorize 23 planets. They kept finding these new objects, kept adding to the planet count, until eventually someone realized that all of these brand new planets are all located in the same orbit. They're all in the same place, the same distance from the Sun. And so maybe instead of finding new planets, what they were actually doing is finding a different type of object. Turns out they were finding asteroids that lived in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. And as soon as they realized that instead of calling them planets, they could then call them a new type of object, they called them asteroids. Well, the planet count went from 23 to 8. Where'd that 8th one come from? Well, the 8th one is Neptune. We declassified all of the asteroids. Those were no longer planets, but we added in Neptune. So now we're up to 8 until 1930. What happens in 1930? Clyde Tombaugh finds Pluto, our 9th planet. Our solar system had 9 planets for roughly 76 years, because in 2006, Pluto got kicked out. Pluto got demoted. Pluto is no longer a planet. We have 7, and then you delete the Sun and the Moon, but you add Earth. So you're at 6 until you find Uranus, and then you keep finding all of these asteroids. We've got Neptune thrown in there. We reclassify the asteroids, and now we add in Pluto, but now we delete Pluto. So right now we are at 8 planets. Seems as though 8 planets is going to be where we stay unless we find planet X, which is probably out there, but it's really far away. If you're curious, here's a link right there. That could bring us back up to 9. And what's a good presentation without a bunch of memes? So 2006, Pluto got demoted. Poor Pluto. It's pretty harsh. Why did Pluto get demoted? Why did Pluto get kicked out? What did Pluto do to anybody? Let's figure it out. So the definition that was set by the IAU, the International Astronomical Union, in 2006 goes as follows. Who is the IAU? They're the ones who come up with which constellations are actual constellations. They're the ones who came up with the definition of a planet, which is actually pretty tricky to do, as you guys probably found earlier in this lesson. They are all of the professional astronomers around the world. They meet every couple of years. They go over new findings. And in 2006, they decided that they needed to come up with the definition of a planet. And I'll tell you why in just a moment. But here is their definition. A planet is a celestial body that is in orbit around the sun. So it's not the moon. Why is our moon not a planet? It doesn't orbit the sun, it orbits the Earth. And so in order to be a planet, you have to orbit the sun. Well, asteroids orbit the sun. But you have to have sufficient mass in order to be basically spherical. We talked about being 400 kilometers in diameter or bigger. If you're bigger than that, you're going to be a sphere, which means even if you orbit the sun, if you're too tiny, you're not a planet because you're not a sphere. But Pluto is a sphere. Pluto orbits the sun and Pluto is round. So why is Pluto not a planet? Here's what kicked Pluto out. There's only 3 criteria, and Pluto did not meet the third one. The third criteria, you have to have cleared your neighborhood of everything else. You can be the only thing in your orbit. You have to be the dominant gravitational body in your orbit. Remember, we asked, why don't we have planets, 2 planets in the same orbit? Well, the reason is those two objects would have either collided or one of them would have been slingshotted out. And all of our 8 planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, all of them are the only thing in their orbit. With a couple weird exceptions, like with Lagrange points and Trojan comets in Jupiter's orbit, but that's kind of a weird physics quirk. Jupiter has cleared everything out of its orbit. It's the only thing there. You have to go a really big distance away from Jupiter to find anything else. There's nothing else in Earth's orbit. Of the 8 planets, they have cleared out their orbit. Pluto has not. Now, what do I mean by that? Pluto is in the Kuiper Belt. And we're going to get to the Kuiper Belt in a few days. The Kuiper Belt is an area of space that has trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of objects just floating around out there. If Pluto was bigger, had more gravity, it would have either attracted them or slingshotted those trillions of objects out. And then Pluto would be the only thing out in that area of its orbit. Pluto would then be a planet. Pluto has not done that. Pluto's too tiny. And because there are so many other objects out where Pluto lives, Pluto has not cleared its orbit. So Pluto was kicked out. So what is Pluto now? What is it? Pluto is now known as a dwarf planet. It's something that is trying to be a planet, but it hasn't met all of the criteria. It's actually a new classification of objects, a trans farther than Neptune object. So it's an object that's farther out than Neptune, and just like we had to reclassify all of those asteroids into a new type of thing, they weren't planets, they're now asteroids. Well, Pluto is not a planet, it's a dwarf planet. It is the first in a series of brand new objects. Pluto is the first ever dwarf planet. Because it does orbit the sun, it is round. The problem is that it has not cleared out its neighborhood. So it can't be considered an actual planet. To be a planet, you need 3 things. I would write those down if I was you. To be a dwarf planet, you need 2 of those 3 things. In orbit around the sun, you have to be round, but you have not cleared out its neighborhood. What if you only have 1 of those things? What if you orbit the sun, but you haven't cleared your neighborhood and you're not big enough to be round, and you're not a moon? Well, then you have a even different designation. You're what's known as a small solar system body. Comets, most asteroids, meteors, those are all small solar system bodies. Write that down. And you might think, well, who cares? Who cares? Why do you care if Pluto has cleared its neighborhood? Why does that make a difference? The reason is that our telescopes keep getting bigger and better, and we can see things farther and farther away from the sun and smaller in size. And we kept finding things out where Pluto lives, in the Kuiper Belt. And if we include Pluto as a planet, that means we had to include the next object that we found as a planet because it was round and it orbited the sun. Turns out, as of 4 years ago, so this has changed, we could possibly have 555 planets in our solar system by now. Now, if you thought it was tricky memorizing the 8 planets in order, I want you to now imagine trying to memorize 555 planets. We keep finding stuff out where Pluto lives, and we either had to keep adding them in as planets, or we had to do what we did with the asteroids and make a new category, dwarf planets, and put all of those new objects into that category. If we didn't do that, this is what astronomy class would look like. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and then the next list, it just keeps going on and on and on and on. And I don't think anybody wants that. After Pluto was demoted, you had a couple people from Harvard actually have a debate. Harvard, you may have heard of that school. It's kind of famous. And after the debate of whether Pluto should be a planet or not, they polled the audience. And overwhelmingly, people wanted Pluto to be a planet. They didn't care about the science. They didn't care about the definition. In their brains, in their hearts, in their memories, Pluto was a planet, and they wanted Pluto to stay a planet. The problem is, science doesn't work like that. Science doesn't work on people's feelings. Science doesn't work on what you want. Science is basically just a way to describe the universe, and you need certain rules and guidelines for that. So Pluto, scientifically, is not a planet, even if people in their hearts want Pluto to be a planet. So let's look at a couple more memes, because Pluto. So what's next? Can Pluto get reinstated? I've actually seen in the news a few times people saying, oh, Pluto's going to get put back as a planet. It's not. Maybe as like in people's hearts, maybe, but as far as the IAU, as far as professional astronomers, Pluto's not going to be put back in a planet. They only meet every couple years. Man, I need to update this. So the next is in 2018, huh? And in 2018, Pluto was not put back as a planet. In order to have the IAU vote on something, you have to have new evidence. You have to have new data. You have to have some new thing to present. There's nothing new about Pluto that would cause it to be a planet. There's people's feelings, but there's no new scientific data that would cause Pluto to then be a planet. If anything, we keep finding things out there. We keep making the case that they made the right decision, and Pluto is not a planet. It's a dwarf planet. Pluto, Pluto, Pluto. This is probably the most harsh. Now that we've figured out that Pluto is not a planet and why, let's take a look at Pluto again. We looked at a couple photos earlier, and we're going to look at some more. This is the best ever ground-based telescope. Here's Pluto. There's Charon, which is one of its 5 moons, the only one that can be seen from the ground. I wonder what telescope took this photo. Huh. Anyway, here is Pluto, there's Charon, and there's a couple more moons. Now we know that Pluto has at least 3. This is a long exposure, which is why it's so bright. But if you don't do a long exposure, this is the most sharp image of Pluto that we ever had until New Horizons, which is a flyby mission, flew right by. So Pluto's like, hey, bye. And Pluto's all by itself again. But New Horizons got us a couple absolutely phenomenal, amazing photographs, pictures. I think one of the coolest is this heart. If you see the little Pluto floating above my head right now, there's a heart. And the reason is that Pluto has an actual heart that is on its surface. Pluto, the planet that everybody loves, loves everybody back. Love Pluto. All right, I'm going to show you guys something that you can't unsee. This is something that once I show it to you guys, it's going to be in your heads for the rest of your life. Pluto has a nice heart on its surface because it loves everybody and everybody loves it. However, what if that's not a heart? What if we take a look at Pluto's heart and it's Pluto? Pluto has Pluto. And now every time that I actually look at a picture of Pluto, I don't see the heart. I see Pluto. How Walt Disney knew that, I have no idea. But Pluto has Pluto. Let's take a look a little bit more at Pluto being weird. First, Pluto is mostly made of rock. It does have an atmosphere, but it would be considered a rocky planet if it was a planet. But it's not in the right place for the rocky planets. It's way out past the gas giants. It's not following the way that our solar system is set up. Not only that, but all of our planets have roughly a circular orbit. They are ellipses, but they're pretty close to being circular. Pluto's is not. Here are all of our planets, pretty circular orbits. Pluto's is very, very elliptical compared to all of them. All of the major planets, all of the 8 planets, are pretty close to the plane of the ecliptic. I think the one that's off the most is only off by like 6 degrees. Pluto orbits at like
16 degrees
off of the plane of the ecliptic. So its orbit does not match any of the other planets. Its composition and size do not match any of the other planets, which means Pluto is kind of an oddball. It doesn't even fit in with the other planets. Pluto is just a little bit smaller than our moon, but we found a dwarf planet. It's farther than Pluto, but it's bigger. And this, Eris, is the reason that Pluto was demoted. Eris was found, and if we included Pluto, there's no reason not to include Eris. Eris is bigger, it orbits the sun, and this would have been planet number 10. After we had added number 10, we would have had 11, and then 12, and then 13, and we would have just kept going. So instead of doing that, both Eris and Pluto are dwarf planets. And this is a Venn diagram of what's up in space. Why is this crooked? I've not been able to figure that out, but just ignore that. So we have our 8 planets. We have moons, like our moon. We have Io, we have Enceladus, we have Titan, we have Charon. And then we have trans-Neptunian objects, which are things out past Neptune. We have dwarf planets, and most of the dwarf planets are trans-Neptunian objects, except for one. There is a dwarf planet that is not out past Neptune, and that dwarf planet is Ceres. What is Ceres? Ceres is the largest asteroid. Ceres is one of those 23 asteroids that was considered a planet back in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, and it is the largest asteroid. It orbits the sun, but because there are other asteroids in its orbit, it has not cleared its area of the solar system. Of course, NASA sent a mission to Ceres, and it turns out that Ceres has 2 super bright spots on it. And we had no clue what that was. Is that a city? Are there aliens living there? Is that a giant solar reflector? They did a flyby. Turns out that it's salt. There are different types of salts, and salts are very reflective compared to the rest of Ceres, and so they stand out. It's a big, giant bed of salt. Not as exciting as an alien city, but still something cool to look at. So here is our solar system to date. There's only 5 dwarf planets. There will undoubtedly be more. We just need better telescopes. We need more data for the things that we've already seen. But the 5 dwarf planets are Ceres, Pluto, Haumea, Makemake, and Eris. There's another one named Quaoar, which I can't pronounce, kind of like Sojourner, whatever. But we've got our 8 planets, and we have our 5 dwarf planets. That's our solar system, and a bunch of moons and asteroids and stuff. But that is our solar system to date. So the biggest Trans-Neptunian objects, here we go. And you might think, wait a minute, I thought it was supposed to be round. Haumea actually is round. It's just spinning so fast that it's being flattened out because of how fast it's spinning. Here are a bunch of other objects, and if they're not already a dwarf planet, they soon will be. So let's take a moment to remember Pluto, because without it, your life would have been exactly the same. Now let's watch a quick little video about what's a planet and what's not a planet. This video has Mike Brown, who is the guy who discovered Eris. So Mike Brown is actually the guy who got Pluto kicked out, which is why he wrote this book. It's actually a pretty good book. There's a link. Enjoy.
Until August 2006, the International Astronomical Union, or IAU, recognized 9 planets in our solar system. But before that, new discoveries had led astronomers to believe that there might actually be 10 or even 12 planets out there.
This will absolutely rewrite the history of astronomy textbooks. There's now a 10th planet out there.
Mike Brown and his team at Caltech announced their discovery of UB313 in July of 2005. They have been involved in the planet debate ever since.
We're in committee limbo, international committee limbo, which is about the worst possible place you could imagine being.
The debate wasn't questioning whether or not the Caltech team had made a significant discovery. They had. The problem lay in the fact that no agreed-upon scientific definition for planet existed until August 2006. The ambiguity surrounding this issue made it hard for astronomers to classify their discoveries and complete their scientific investigations.
Did you know that in 1801, a new planet was discovered orbiting between Mars and Jupiter? They called it Ceres, and then they looked some more, they found another planet. And another, and another. The count of planets in the early 1800s was greater than it is today. 13 planets in the solar system. And they kept looking, and the numbers kept growing, and they were running out of names. And they realized, rather than counting new planets, they had discovered a new swath of real estate in the solar system called the asteroid belt.
Ceres was then moved into a different class. Instead of a planet, it became the biggest asteroid. The same dispute engulfed Pluto.
It's got enough ice so that if you were to take Pluto and transport it to where Earth is right now, the heat from the sun would evaporate the ice and it would grow a tail. And that's just no kind of behavior for a planet. We have words for things with tails. They're called comets.
So, what is a planet? After much deliberation, the IAU decided that a planet is a body that orbits a star, has enough mass to create its own gravity, has a round shape, and has cleared its neighborhood. According to this, Pluto is not a planet. It hasn't cleared the area around its orbit because it crosses paths with Neptune. So, it has been reclassified as a dwarf planet. And though it originally seemed that Ceres and UB313 were rocketing toward planethood, they now join Pluto in the dwarf planet category. But in fact, confusion continues because Neptune, which is still classified as a planet, has not cleared Pluto from its orbit. So, case closed? Not quite. Even though the IAU has provided a definition for planet, scientific understanding is always evolving, and as new discoveries are made, planet qualifications may continue to change.
And now I want to know your thoughts. Is Pluto a planet? Should it be a planet? Yes, no? Read through this. Let me know what you think.